In this podcast episode, Zach Lahn, a gubernatorial candidate in Iowa with a deep personal connection to the state's agricultural heritage, discusses a wide range of systemic issues affecting Iowa and the nation. The conversation delves into cultural loss, land ownership crises, monopolistic practices in agriculture, rising cancer rates, the decline of rural communities, the intersections of spirituality and stewardship of the land, concerns about political and economic systems, and broader cultural and technological challenges. Zach Lahn begins by explaining his motivation for entering politics, centered not on policy minutiae, but on preserving culture, heritage, and values. His family's multi-generational Iowa farm, originally built by his great-great-grandfather, who immigrated from Germany in the 1850s, symbolizes a legacy at risk of being lost. By painstakingly restoring the original farmhouse using historic photographs and family stories, Lahn emphasizes the importance of intergenerational storytelling and understanding one's roots. He argues that contemporary political discourse often neglects these foundational cultural questions, and he sees a need to restore connection to community, tradition, and identity as a prerequisite to addressing policy. Lahn highlights several deep systemic problems in Iowa that transcend typical political talking points like taxes and regulations. Foremost among these is the exodus of young adults, particularly people aged 25 to 29, moving out of Iowa at alarming rates. This trend threatens the social and economic fabric of rural communities. Furthermore, he points to the significant shift in farmland ownership. Approximately 25% of Iowa's farmland is now held by out-of-state investors, often anonymously via LLCs and trusts. This disconnect between landowners and the local communities erodes stewardship, neighborliness, and the agrarian way of life. Lahn stresses that land is not merely an economic asset, but a cultural and spiritual foundation meant to be preserved across generations. A major issue Lahn raises is the domination of key agricultural input markets by a handful of multinational corporations, Bayer, Corteva, and Syngenta, with Syngenta owned by the Chinese state. These corporations control over 85% of fertilizers, seeds, and agrochemical products sold to farmers. The lack of competitive pricing leads to inflated input costs that severely squeeze farmers' already razor-thin margins. For instance, the cost of nitrogen-based fertilizers in Iowa is substantially higher than in comparable agricultural regions like Brazil. Lahn pledges to pursue antitrust actions against these monopolies to protect local farmers from exploitation. He also condemns illegal regional price discrimination and tacit collusion that unfairly extract wealth from Iowa's agricultural sector. Lahn discusses the widespread continued use of herbicides like glyphosate, Roundup, in farming, despite growing evidence of health risks. He shares alarming research about paraquat, a herbicide linked to a doubling of Parkinson's disease risk and still used on hundreds of thousands of Iowa acres with EPA approval. Drawing on insider documents known as the Monsanto Papers, he presents a narrative of corporate capture of regulatory agencies where scientific studies have been manipulated or suppressed, and risks downplayed to facilitate sales. Lahn stresses the need for transparency and truthful scientific communication so farmers can make informed decisions about these chemicals' safety and use. He also connects the environmental degradation and chemical exposure directly to Iowa's unprecedented rise in cancer rates, particularly in rural counties where outdoor lifestyles and low smoking rates would normally predict lower cancer incidence. A stark fact presented is that Iowa has the fastest-growing cancer rate in recorded human history, and rural counties exhibit the highest incidence. Lahn notes the striking disconnect between low smoking rates and high cancer prevalence, signaling external environmental factors at work. He underscores personal tragedy by revealing that his father, a crop consultant who spent decades in the fields, was diagnosed with a cancer linked to chemical exposure, but is now in remission. This crisis extends beyond individual loss to threaten the vitality and longevity of entire Midwestern communities, exacerbating demographic and economic decline. A deeper philosophical and spiritual thread runs throughout the discussion. Lahn recalls being taught to see sunsets and nature's beauty as divine gifts, and laments how modern practices threaten this sacred relationship. He quotes Wendell Berry's emphasis on community impact being the fundamental question before any change is made, arguing that national politics has long ignored such vital considerations. Lahn sees stewardship of land, labor, and community as a moral duty embedded in Christian tradition and American founding principles. The degradation of natural beauty and ecosystems is portrayed not just as environmental crisis, but as a spiritual assault on the nation's soul. Lahn situates Iowa's plight within a broader context of economic and social shifts driven by market fundamentalism and free trade policies dating back to the 1980s. These policies facilitated the offshoring of jobs, decimated manufacturing in the Midwest, and weakened family and community structures. He critiques unregulated capitalism cloaked in the language of free markets, describing it instead as corporatism or oligarchy, which enriches elite investors while stripping meaningful labor and purpose from ordinary Americans. He emphasizes the critical role of meaningful work, especially manual and agricultural labor, as a source of dignity and identity, now endangered by both economic centralization and technological displacement. Embedded in the conversation is a meditation on the human need not simply to own, but to create. Lahn distinguishes between material possession and the deeper fulfillment found in producing and nurturing life, whether it be children, crops, or craftsmanship. He warns against over-reliance on automation and artificial intelligence, viewing the outsourcing of creative and cognitive labor to machines as an existential threat to human uniqueness and purpose. He also condemns attempts to digitally recreate human relationships, such as AI avatars of deceased relatives, as a further erosion of authentic human experience and heritage. Lahn expresses deep disillusionment with the current political system, which he sees as dominated by unelected bureaucrats and special interests disconnected from the interests of ordinary citizens. He points to the inertia surrounding increasing land ownership by out-of-state investors, monopolies in agriculture, and transparency issues. His disdain extends to both major parties and to the uni-party system where bipartisan votes support spending programs disconnected from voter priorities. He laments the stifling of cultural and religious expressions foundational to the American experiment, which he sees as fueling the current constitutional and cultural crises. The discussion touches on demographic and immigration issues framed through the lens of replacement migration, a topic rarely admitted publicly, but documented by UN studies predicting population decline in Western nations and proposed immigration as a solution. Lahn explains concerns that native populations, particularly young white males, are feeling alienated culturally and politically. He advocates for policies that protect and revitalize indigenous communities while thoughtfully integrating newcomers who respect local traditions. Emphasizing assimilation and shared values, he stresses the historical precedent of immigrant families adopting new identities while honoring their heritage. Despite the grim realities painted, Lahn articulates a vision centered on rebuilding a strong, sustainable agrarian society rooted in family farms, community ties, stewardship, and faith. Drawing inspiration from historical figures, agrarian writers like Wendell Berry, and personal experience, he calls for reinvigorating neighborhood connections, prioritizing health and longevity, reining in corporate excess, and protecting the land for future generations. He rejects reductionist economic doctrines in favor of a holistic approach that values culture, creation, and the moral obligations to one's community and environment. Lahn reveals that his candidacy is unconventional, motivated by principle rather than political ambition, and pledged to avoid special interest money. With a primary election scheduled for June 2nd and a general election in November, he anticipates resistance from entrenched interests, but hopes his focus on culture, community, and truth resonates with Iowans frustrated by the status quo. He believes the moment is ripe for a new kind of leadership that foregrounds honest discussion of systemic problems and champions authentic, generational stewardship over short-term political expediency.